Well, I have joining me now via Zoom Dr. Carrie Odermann. She's a global affairs expert. We'll be discussing our major stories today, which are the Russia-Ukraine war plus the U.S. role in dealing with Russian allies. Good to have you this weekend. Now, the European leaders are said to be working out a possible buffer zone to end the war in Ukraine. Please help us understand what this buffer zone means for Ukraine and, looking at history, what buffer zones signify.
I think that using historical examples are a good way to jump into this conversation because they are a focus of wars of the past. And President Zelensky, in his statements today, was continually repeating that the war in Ukraine is a war where technology is constantly changing how we understand war. And by using solutions of the past for basically a war of the future, there is not going to be a long-term solution. The buffer zone, as you listed, like the Iron Curtain, like between North and South Korea, no longer applies simply because, as Zelensky pointed out in his statement, there is a buffer zone of sorts because of the drones and the artillery in the area, which means there is about what they call a dead zone or a gray zone of 10 kilometers where there is technically a buffer. However, because the nature of war is changing, we can no longer look at it just kinetically. And I think that's also a point that Zelensky is trying to make. It's not just about the technology with the drones, the AI systems that are being calibrated to operate independently in some cases, but it's also hacking, gray zone activities. So a buffer zone is not going to stop that.
Now, one wonders as well, what must have prompted the EU to, come up with this buffer zone plan?
I think the EU is trying to do the best with the resources it has. Right now, they're scrambling to make up for weapons that they don't yet have that would need to be applied to the situation in Ukraine. The talk of a buffer zone could be a way to stall the inevitable, especially with the idea of over 100,000 troops amassing. Again, the fear of a major fall offensive. Those of you that have been following the Ukraine war, you know that there's always been talk of a big push before the winter, before the muddy season starts and things start to get difficult. This is a little bit differently because we've had so many iterations of drone technology that the same circumstances that made a muddy winter conflict difficult with the drones has changed. And I don't quite have an answer to how the new drone technology with the fiber optics is going to make an advance in the fall different than it was in the past.
Now, how effective or what are the consequences with what you've raised from what Zelensky says? How would it impact, considering a buffer zone?
I don't think President Zelensky is willing to accept a buffer zone, and I really don't think it's a feasible idea. What's really needed is security guarantees. There can be a buffer zone, but who is going to be there to make sure that people stay on their side, soldiers stay on their side of the zone? And that wasn't exactly a Freudian slip by saying that people stay on their sides, because this is very important because there are people still living in the areas where active fighting is taking place. So it's important that the idea of the buffer zone, I think, was an old answer to an old concept of war. And as Europe is playing catch up right now with defense spending, but also the EU and the NATO alliance is working on how to redefine what they consider war. And things like the NATO alliance and how they define in Article 5 activity and what would trigger that. This is all very fluid right now.
So, from what you've said, it's obvious that, we're dealing with the issue of now versus the technology back then. But then let me draw your attention to NATO. NATO recently, with the EU, some of the chiefs talked about, security guarantees, just like you mentioned in the course of your explanation with regards the, protection of the Ukrainian territory. Should that be the direction of the EU right now instead of, spending money on, buffer zones and all of that?
Well, the things go hand in hand. To have a buffer zone, you need it enforced. And any type of enforcement is what I consider a security guarantee. What Ukraine has probably learned from the 1994 Budapest Memorandum is, and that is when they gave up their nuclear capacity for security protections, that wording is very important and the intent behind it. Both the United States and Russia said that they would offer Ukraine security guarantees if they gave up their nuclear arsenal, and that wasn't the case. So security guarantees that are clear and well defined are very important. And then there may be a line of demarcation. But I think President Zelensky has more experience in this type of modern warfare than any other world leader right now. And if he says a buffer zone is an illusion, I tend to believe him.
Now, do you foresee Zelensky being blamed in the end for refusing to cede some territories? I mean, talking about this border buffer zone idea. I mean, you know that Trump is on the sidelines waiting, so fingers might begin to point to the fact that he's sabotaging the peace efforts.
I think Zelensky will be held responsible and given credit for a lot of things. When he was elected, he won with about 73% of the vote. And his popularity, despite being in a war right now, is around 50%, although it does go up and down. When he won the election, he claimed that he would not run for re-election. And Ukraine cannot have an election in wartime. It also wouldn't be safe to have people gathering at polling stations, especially with how Russia is targeting civilians right now. It is part of the Ukrainian constitution that land cannot be given up, just like it's part of the Ukrainian constitution that during a war, an election can't be held. Zelensky's hand may be forced and he may be blamed, but at the end of the day, it is Ukrainian lives that are being lost. And there could become a consensus within Ukraine that sacrificing part of Ukrainian territory to ensure that the 20,000 children that are in Russian custody come back, the prisoners of war, the civilians, the journalists that are also in Russian custody come back. That might be a good trade-off.
Now, also to add to that, as a global, affairs expert, are there ways to approach, issues like this? And what do you make of the Russian president still stalling the meeting between the two countries?
Well, I think I've pointed out in the past that it only took about 5 days for him to decide to attend the summit in Alaska with Trump. And that was planned. And he's been traveling quite a bit. He's on his way now to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, and he has no problems traveling there. The idea of him dragging his feet to me is an idea of trying to stall. Now, with these troops that Zelensky was speaking about, and the press has been talking about 100,000, this might be the reason that he is trying to stall. He may feel like he's backed up into the corner, he being Putin, of course, backed into the corner right now with some of the resources that are available to him. I've mentioned in the past that wars may start on the battlefield, but they're ending at the bank, and there's not a clear idea of exactly how much liquidity the Russian sovereign fund still has, but it's getting down pretty low right now. And the war costs about 300 billion a month. So he may have to move fast, and this amassing of troops might be one last push to grab what he can before he's forced to a negotiation table because he's just running out of cash.
Now, briefly, just can you explain how NATO can, come into this? Any possibility or any chance that that could happen?
Well, I think that NATO will have less to do with any solutions that are found. Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and although recently a Russian drone has gone, I think, at least 100 kilometers into Poland, that also did not trigger Article 5. What we should really be watching with a lot of interest is the role of the EU as a unit and how France and Germany are changing their roles. Germany is stepping up with the new Chancellor, Friedrich Merz. Germany has decided no longer to lead from behind, but to lead from the front. They're looking at getting about 60,000 more Bundeswehr, German army soldiers, and German conscription is being reevaluated. That conscription having ended in the mid-aughts, the mandatory conscription of 18-year-old young men. So Germany is beefing things up, and NATO has a recommended budget of each NATO member should spend 3% of its GDP on defense and defense readiness. But the EU has upped that up to 5%. Now, there are some goodies in that basket, so to speak, for infrastructure for the domestic audience within Europe, bridges, streets, infrastructure that could be used to move military equipment, but would also help communities function more efficiently. But it's the EU that's really pushing towards being combat ready in a lot of ways.
Now, just finally, because we have to wrap our head around what the U.S. is doing with regards to Russia's allies. For over a decade, India has, styled itself as a key node in the new multipolar order. One foot in Washington, another in Moscow, and a wary eye on Beijing. How, do India and other allies play a role in this war indirectly, and would you blame Trump for a tariff hike for India?
India and China have been becoming closer and closer over the past years, and the tariff hike will not be the reason, but it will accelerate the development of this relationship. The White House said that India, the world's largest democracy, when it buys Russian oil, is just like China. However, it's applied higher tariffs to India, traditional partner of theirs, than it has to China, which has many, many people baffled. And what we're seeing now is something that is finally what has been in the making for a long time. Countries are rejecting the unpredictability of Trump, and they're turning towards predictability and stability. Even adversaries or people that have had a wary eye towards each other, like China and India, especially concerning border issues, are, when they talk about their relationship now, the words stability and predictability keep coming up. This, of course, really benefits China, but also if we're going to have a podium, it's going to put China on the first place and Russia on the second place.
Right. I wish we had more time to talk, but thank you so much, Dr. Carrie Odermann, for joining us on The World to discuss the major top stories today.